Many months ago, actually almost a year ago at this point, there were talks about a Batman Arkham Asylum remake slash reboot. Essentially, and some of this has been hinted at in terms of WB posting job listings and things kind of hinting at the possibility of another Batman game, especially as, WB realizes they lost money on things. I wanted to take a look at the idea today of should there even ever be a Batman Arkham Asylum remake? What are the risks of doing this? What would it actually mean for the series? Would it actually breathe new life into an old series? Would it do something like Metal Gear Solid Delta appears to be doing, being faithful to the original while expanding on it? Or would it be a mistake? That's something I want to take a look at today because I actually do believe there are a lot of risks involved for WB, Rocksteady, or any company that wanted to touch this in terms of what Arkham Asylum did and what it was at the time. Now, are there things that could be added on to Arkham Asylum? Sure. We can talk about that, and I might mention a couple here, and I've been kind of brewing up a top 5 of things I'd want to see if they did a remake at some point. But in general, I think that it's something where it's hard to gauge if the positives actually outweigh the negatives on this one. And so I will leave that question to you for the question of the day. Do you think that Batman Arkham Asylum would benefit from a remake? Would you buy a remake? What are your thoughts on the existence of one just in general? I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts down below. Now, when it comes down to it, I said this previously in a video, like I said about 8 months ago when I'm recording this, that there are multiple types of remakes. There's the type of remake that completely gets it wrong, kind of shits the bed, doesn't really understand what the original was, and tries to change everything. There's the type of remake that tries to add on to the lore of the original and tries to do something different and is still good. To me, I think of something like Final Fantasy VII's remakes. I even mentioned that there, where it's like, I still think these are very good games, but they're certainly not the original Final Fantasy VII. They're fundamentally different. And then there's remakes that are very, very faithful. That's something that it looks like something like Metal Gear Solid Delta, a bit of a tongue twister there, is aiming for, with preserving original voice lines, redoing some of the music, doing new graphics and new gameplay mechanics, making the world bigger, but not trying to expand the story. Now, the thing with Arkham is it's almost a catch-22. If you go back to Arkham Asylum and you don't include some of the cut content that was in there, or that was thought of for the game, things like the lighthouse being explorable, things like the Mad Hatter maze, if you don't do those things, you're not expanding the game in any way, and it already kind of makes me wonder, with a full, complete, focused game like Arkham Asylum, why touch it if you're not going to expand it? I suppose you could bring the combat up to the detailed level it is in something like Arkham City or even Arkham Knight. I suppose you could streamline a few things, but the clunkiness, in some ways, of the game, the way it is currently balanced, the way that the enemies are laid out, they're already intentionally that way, where you almost have to redesign all of that from the ground up if you decide to add these extra layers. Think about just a very, very simple thing like the instant takedowns that you got in Batman Arkham Knight. When you would fill up your fear meter, you would be able to essentially take out multiple enemies at once. That's very different of a Predator style, and some people actually hated that. Some people thought it made it way too easy, it streamlined it too much. That's a far different Predator gameplay style than the gameplay style of Arkham Asylum, where you're in cramped, tight corridors, and even the big rooms are not nearly as big as an open environment. There are a lot of things to think about from a gameplay balancing standpoint when redoing Arkham, and I think that with Arkham as well, it's difficult because I would argue that these games are already modern gaming masterpieces, especially in the superhero genre, where overall, it has been a lot of just games that are fine. There have been good games, there have been some great games, but if you look at the amount of superhero games made, I'm not just talking about modern, I'm talking about all the way back. You look at the amount of superhero games that are made, They were on the NES, the SNES, the Genesis. They were on the PS1, the PS2, the GameCube, the Xbox, the 360. I mean, superhero games have been around for a very, very, very long time. And you look at the amount of them that are actually amazing games, it is the minority of them. A lot of them were created to be licensed tie-ins or licensed cash grabs almost to work off of the popularity of the character. And a lot of the good ones were already just things like fighting games, you know, Marvel vs. Capcom, things like that. I mean, when they did Arkham Asylum, they knocked it out of the park and followed it up with a game like Arkham City a little later on. You're looking at a game like that with an amazing reputation from a team that, as I mentioned about a year ago, has largely changed. People like Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker, regardless of how you might feel about them now from their involvement in things like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League and the reports from Bloomberg that they were the ones pushing for that game to be made and all these things. Whether you believe that stuff or not, whether you still love them or you think now, oh, they're washed up, it doesn't matter, because guess what? They're gone. They're not even at that company anymore. They're not even at Rocksteady. These co-founders are gone. You have had such a turnover, and you end up having such a turnover in the gaming industry. It is an industry where people are constantly moving, and that's also something I mentioned before that I think is a risk, is that this game worked because the people in the kitchen all came together to make the secret sauce. You know? And you think about it, you think about a restaurant, and video games are actually, believe it or not, kind of like a restaurant. You know, you have everybody who runs different pieces of it. You have the waiter or waitress. You have the person at the desk sometimes. You'll have things like the chefs, multiple chefs in the kitchen, or cooks, or whatever you want to call them. Have you ever been to a restaurant and the food fundamentally tastes different? It's just not the same as it was years ago. A lot of times that's because the same people aren't there. People mix ingredients differently. People do things differently. That's something that you see in video game development. You swap out one piece of the puzzle, you swap out one important person that thought of something innovative in the original game that maybe isn't even credited for it. Maybe they fixed something that would have fundamentally broken the combat. Maybe they fixed something that improved the gameplay speed of the Predator sections by 10%. Those people came together to make that game at that time with the perfect crew and cast of characters. And unfortunately, some of these people are no longer even with us. You know, you look at someone like Kevin Conroy, who I always say was like someone with the heart of who Batman was. You know, a good man, but also someone who is extremely talented. If you wanted to expand Arkham Asylum now, how would you do that without him? You know, if you wanted to do just a on-the-ground, exactly the same game, I suppose you could, and you could go Metal Gear Solid 3 to Delta style, but that game also benefited from being in these wide open spaces with the jungle and all these different things. Batman Arkham is already this confined, narrow, focused game. Say you wanted to add on a gameplay mechanic without the voice of Kevin Conroy, I feel like that's going to be a lot harder than just adding in more hunting in a game like Metal Gear. And I bring up Metal Gear because when I talk about this, and when I've talked about it before, one of the defenses I see for it is they could just make it a one-to-one, you know, recreation of the story just with faster gameplay or this or that. But it's like that would mess up all of the balancing. You'd have to rework everything. But then the answer is, oh, well, they could just not do that. They could expand it. They could add in those cut features or those ideas for content we never got. I made a couple of videos on this channel about rejected media for Arkham Asylum. One of them was this whole idea to do a side quest, essentially with Mad Hatter and this hedge maze that's kind of themed after Alice in Wonderland, stuff like that. How would you do that without Kevin? You know, would you recast Batman for that part? I feel like that would be ridiculous. You switch from Kevin to Roger Craig Smith in the same game? I love Roger Craig Smith, but that would be kind of weird. Okay, well then, we can't do that. Okay, well then we recast Batman completely. Now you're gonna have all the comparisons of Kevin delivered this exact line way better than so-and-so. Kevin did this way better than so-and-so. And hey, you know what? Unfortunately, I'd probably be right there. It would be very hard to not make that comparison. to not look at, voice acting legends and make that comparison. But if you don't have Kevin, you don't have Mark Hamill. He brought Joker to life for Arkham Asylum. So you're kind of boxed in where you almost have to do a one-to-one recreation. But at that point, I look at it and I say, okay, well, if you're doing an exact one-to-one recreation, I almost wonder why. The gameplay hasn't really aged poorly. I know some people think it's clunkier, and it is clunkier, but it hasn't aged terribly. It was an Xbox 360 and PS3 era game. So you have to either box yourself in where you're going to have to recast voice actors, completely add on to the game, and hope that it's received well because this game was a legend, or you're going to have to do a one-for-one on a game that already didn't age poorly. Listen, here's the thing. Has that never been done before? I mean, obviously it's been done before. We're even seeing it right now with Assassin's Creed 4. The remake is all but confirmed. Did that game age poorly? No. Does it really need a remake? No. But then you're also going to have the soullessness critique. You're going to have people looking at this and saying, well, it didn't age poorly. The voice actor died. You're reusing his voice. Obviously, you can do these things. But it also will come off to many like soullessness, like a lack of ideas. Like, well, we didn't know what to do, so we just went back and improved the gameplay of Asylum. That's also boxing you in a way where you're going to be very much critiqued. And after things like Suicide Squad, after things like Gotham Knights, which I know was more on WB Games Montreal, but still under the WB banner, after the cancellation of Wonder Woman, which might have ended up being the best or worst superhero game ever made. Who knows? Because no one involved is allowed to talk about it, obviously. So it's something where it's like, you just kind of have to imagine what that could have been until someone 10 years from now when an NDA runs out spills the beans on it. We're looking at a company that really needs to recover their image. And I think dealing with an Arkham Asylum remake would really box them in and open them to a lot of criticism, a lot of critique, and wouldn't be a good look. The atmosphere of Arkham Asylum is also very, very unique where you have these cramped corridors, you have this more horror style. It was already difficult to nail the first time, I'm sure. Recreating that for the modern day probably wouldn't be easy, especially with an audience that will know every twist and turn before they come because they've played the game. And I kind of leave you with this thought. While there are things that I think could be really cool, like if you wanted to do, a remaster, that kind of thing could be cool, kind of like Return to Arkham, but do it a little differently. I guess my question is like, why wouldn't you just do that? Why wouldn't you clean up the graphics of this already beautiful game? Maybe add in, if you want to, some more collectibles. Maybe some more, Riddler challenges where it's just like some riddles you put in the world. You wouldn't even need voice lines around those. You just have Batman go scan them and they pop up. A few more Riddler trophies. Anything like this. More costumes. Adding official costume support to actually add more than just the normal costume and the armored costume. Things like that. Almost an Arkham Asylum Definitive Edition, where you have extra costumes, maybe extra collectibles, maybe even some more challenge maps, those kinds of things. Why wouldn't you just do something like that and actually restore the game for modern consoles? PS5, Xbox Series X, whatever. Obviously, you could do it for PC as well, but PC already has access to Arkham as it was. But with more content like that, that's something you could do without actually remaking a game and building up those expectations. But that's all stuff that you really could add into a remaster. Why not just do something like that if you're revisiting Arkham, instead of setting the bar this high and boxing yourself in so many ways? Those are kind of my thoughts on it. I just think it's a bad idea overall. I think that if Kevin was still with us, I think that it would be different. Because if Kevin Conroy had wanted to come back as Batman, and they had wanted to reimagine, I know that's a scary word that usually means it's gonna suck, but what I mean is like in a good way, reimagine Arkham Asylum with Kevin back, and maybe he would, kind of bring back in Mark, because Mark loved working with Kevin, and you had that cast there. I would say the sky's the limit on being able to add to it, do cut content, things like that, but we don't have that anymore. And I think this is another example of WB, whether you want to blame whatever era of management, WB in general, dragging their feet along on ideas, and then Kevin Conroy passed away because he's a human being and human beings sadly leave us. And now they are thinking about revisiting this thing that he was involved in. I feel like that right there is just such a touchy subject and a weird idea to do, where it's not a side character, you know, even though that would still be odd. It's not like you're recasting, you know, someone like Scarecrow, where they're in the game and prominent, but like they're not the voice you're always hearing. You're recasting for a lot of people, the definitive Batman, and then trying to play with it in a game that is legendary and tinker with a game that is legendary. I say instead of tearing the car apart and doing an entire new build, why don't you just restore the car that is already there if you want to do something, and add a couple of, you know, quality of life upgrades. Those are the kinds of things I could see that would be almost zero risk, high reward. Regardless, my point is I think it would just please everybody. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts down below, especially because I know Return to Arkham added a lot of visual effects people didn't like. That's kind of why I say keeping it in that same vein of actually being more faithful to the original look. Just doing that kind of thing is something I think would be a far less risk and would lead to a better product, a better game overall, and a better preservation of the original ideas of this art. Interested to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, you want to leave a like, subscribe, I appreciate you very, very, very much. I hope you have a fantastic day. If you want to support this channel, Fortnite code DJAY123 helps us out a lot. It's helped us a ton recently. I appreciate it. I appreciate those of you who picked up the Fantastic Four with that. That was awesome to see. Love you guys. Appreciate it. And also, we do have our own store, CosmoBunny.shop. You can use code DJAY123 there for 10% off your first purchase. Coasters, keychains, trays, and more made from recycled paper from comics, manga, magazines, and more that have been damaged. What we do is we take that paper, transform it into something new, in a new medium, into new pieces of art, and then recycle the rest and make sure that does not end up in landfills. Like I said, code DJAY123. We're going to be having new products over there starting soon, kind of get back in the production of things and preparing for a convention that we're going to in just like a month and a half here. So have a fantastic day. As always, everyone, stay shui.